Good evening. Good evening and welcome. My name is Jim Leiker, Professor of History, and it's my pleasure to welcome you to the second annual installment of the Kansas Lecture Series. The goal of the series is to bring to campus prominent individuals whose life work showcases the issues that concern all Kansans. Coordination of this series is one of the functions of the Kansas Studies Institute at Johnson County Community College. The Institute promotes research and teaching on the cultures, art, economics, and natural environment of our state. This is accomplished through frequent tours for staff, faculty, and visitors, a series of adult classes offered through community services, and the development of educational videos and documentaries related to Kansas themes. Introducing Stan Hurd is my friend and colleague, Allison Smith. An associate professor and chair of the Art History Department, Dr. Smith joined the faculty of JCCC in 2006. Since then, she has served on the Advisory Board and Acquisitions Committee of the Nerman Museum of Contemporary Art and coordinates the Friday Noon at the Nerman series, all in between teaching courses in art history on the ancient and Renaissance periods and of the 20th century. Please extend a friendly welcome to Allison Smith.
I first learned of Stan Hurd's artwork, dare I say it, about 20 years ago when I was an art history student. And I was studying at the American University in Washington, D.C., and was given an assignment by my teacher for a presentation topic. And all of the students in the class received topics such as abstract expressionism, pop art, performance art, and the like. And then I received my assignment, which was earth art. And my fellow students looked at me and they said, earth art? Wow, I have two. Earth art, you know, good luck with that one. And I began to do research on my topic of earth art, and I quickly realized that there were a number of artists who addressed the notion of landscape in their art. Of course, landscape is a theme that's been a familiar one in art history for many, many years. But I realized very quickly that these artists were ones who involved the landscape itself in their work. They didn't paint images of the landscape, they created their artwork out of the landscape. Artists like Robert Smithson, Walter D. Maria, Michael Heiser, and Nancy Holt were featured in my short student presentation. But the artist who caught my fellow students' attention the most was a man who called himself a crop artist from Lawrence, Kansas, Stan Hurd. And of course, I had absolutely no idea that some 20 years later, I would have the opportunity to become friends with Stan and the opportunity to stand here and introduce him to my art history students. And for that opportunity, I thank the Kansas Studies Institute and the Nerman Museum of Contemporary Art. Stan Hurd has received numerous awards for his work, including the Kansas Governor's Arts Award, and he has been featured in such publications as the U.S. News and World Report, the Wall Street Journal, Smithsonian Magazine, and the New York Times. He has received commissions to create earthworks all over the world, including England, Dubai, Cuba, Costa Rica, California, and New York. And of course, a number of his works are here in Kansas, including the work located near Haskell Indian Nations University. By manipulating plants, soil, and rock, Stan Hurd creates large-scale works of art that often require an aerial photographer to fully appreciate. There's a certain irony, I think, in the fact that the viewer must be quite a distance away from some of Stan's works to understand its design, as it requires such an intimacy on the part of the artist with the land and the materials. Working with organic materials, Stan Hurd is able to address issues facing our natural resources and call attention to the state of the land in which he creates his works. Having been born and raised in the small farming community of Protection, Kansas, Hurd is able to simultaneously acknowledge the importance of the plow while addressing the challenges inherent in the complex relationship between the farmer and the landscape. In addition to his crop art, Stan also is a painter, and he has created a number of large-scale murals across the country. His work has been featured on CBS's Sunday Morning, National Public Radio's All Things Considered, Dateline NBC, and Late Night with David Letterman. No one, of course, can discuss the work of Stan Hurd better than the artist himself, so without further ado, please join me in welcoming Stan Hurd.
That's it. Testing, 1, 2, 3. Can you hear me? So this mic's off, or do we? Yeah, so I can walk around and walk up and down the aisle like Mick Jagger. I got to take my son to the Rolling Stones concert 2 years ago down in Wichita, and he was 17 at the time, and I was just amazed that this like 65-year-old guy was running around on stage like that, and I thought, boy, I'm only 59. It's very much an honor to be here today at JCCC. Heard about it forever, visited over the years, have friends that have gone to school here. My son almost went here because he liked the music program, stayed in Lawrence. But I see a few faces I recognize out there. I've been visiting with Jim and Allison and Bruce and folks here at Leica with the horticulture, and without letting the cat out of the bag too soon, our hope is that maybe in the future I might be back for a permanent work, and if that's the case, I would love for you all to be there to plant the first flower. So this is an invitation. I'm going to jump into my show. It's about 40 minutes. I've told Bruce to throw a rock at me if I drone on too long, and I would like to open up to conversation at the end. I love the question and answer thing the most. So I start my slideshow with a picture of my meager beginnings, small town farm boy. I'm second from the left. My brother Stuart, my brother Steve, my sister Cheryl, 2 other siblings would follow, but my mother groomed us all in those early days in southwest Kansas to become doctors and lawyers and something important. And I drifted off to Wichita State University and came back like this. And I really wasn't nearly that cool, but I could affect a pose. And I could play that guitar. So I went to Wichita State on an art scholarship. I'm 60, so that was, well, a lot of years ago. I painted. I was a little out of my bearing. I actually submitted my work to the Kansas City Art Institute and was received. But it was from a town of 700 people to downtown Kansas City. It was a little unnerving for me. So on the way back home, we went to Wichita State, and I did my year there. I did drop out of school and started pursuing music for a bit, and just wasn't really very good at it. But I looked good, didn't I? Which is half the battle. But I took seriously after moving back to my hometown 3 or 4 years in Wichita, a little bit beat up, trying to do my art, bartending, doing different things, a broken heart and a love affair gone bad, and came back to my hometown at 20 years of age and met my father and my mother for the first time as an adult, and really kind of got my father, the man who worked the land. When I was at Wichita and I was hanging out with students whose fathers were executives at Boeing, they would say, well, what does your dad do? And he's a farmer, pig farmer. And by the time I got back at 20, I had a great appreciation for who he was and the independence of the man that worked the land. He struggled, but he raised us all. And so I spent a winter feeding cattle with him and began to paint the landscape again down there. This is actually a later painting, but my painting style just varies wildly from one month to the next, and it's either lack of self-discipline or a sense of adventure. I don't know which. But I love the Kansas landscape, and obviously at Wichita State, I dabbled in every ism from Cubism to abstract expressionism, and really fashioned myself as an avant-garde kind of hip cat that was going to go to the top and discover the next movement in abstract art, and it just never really quite happened. So I ended up back in Dodge City after 3 or 4 years at Wichita, and set up a studio in Dodge City and began to paint murals and the commissions came from people that wanted the Western heritage, and I was pretty good at that. I throw this in, I'm not sure why this early, but this is Robert Oppenheimer's Canceled Crop, and I discovered after I conceived the idea on an airplane flight that maybe I could manipulate the landscape for earthworks, utilizing the skills that generations of my family had cultivated, raising crops. I discovered that Oppenheimer had done this, I think, in '68. And so certainly I'm not the first person to go out into the landscape. I was somewhat aware of Smithson and Heiser and Walter de Maria and Holt and some of the people that Allison showed you earlier. Christo was the one that snapped my head. I was in Dodge City. I had the land. I had convinced the farmer to give me the land to create whatever the hell I wanted to create, which was pretty exciting. And I was struggling. 2 years into it, I was going to actually do it on my father's land. The wheat was hailed out, and I just couldn't make myself get out there. I kept thinking somebody's going to come along and go, that's a genius idea, young man. Here's some money. Why don't you go do that? Well, I finally figured out that ain't going to happen. And I saw a film on Christo's Running Fence, and I realized that the process, that the conceptualization, that the cultivating of the idea and walking an art concept out into the general population that doesn't usually even support art and convincing them that they should buy into this work was what the art's about. It's not the final manifestation, the final photograph of the running fence. It's that process. Lawyers, Christo had a hell of a run to get a piece going. And it hit me when I saw that. I've been making my art for 2 years now. There's just nothing visible to be seen yet. So I went back out and redoubled my efforts, and in 6 months I had my first portrait of Setanta, 160 acres, so that's 160 football fields in size. The tractors somewhere. Well, that's a farmstead up there. So because we are flyover country and the people on the coast think of Kansas as a place to look out the window at, I decided that if I was going to reach those folks at 30,000 feet in a TWA, I needed to do 160 acres. So the original idea was to grow this thing, and I wanted to utilize all the beautiful fall crops of Kansas, the milo, 3 different colors of milo, a winter wheat, stubble, brown earth, and I just wasn't able to pull that off financially, so I realized that I needed to do a sketch. As all we artists know, you need to work in black and white before you try to even attempt color. So I started off with just simply subtracting out Setanta's portrait. Setanta was a Kiowa war chief, made most famous in his death after his second incarceration, he leapt from a second-story building and landed on his head rather than be in a white man's prison. And I was kind of fascinated by that. I did eventually meet Fran the Flying Man, who was related to Setanta, White Bear. And since that time, I've developed a pretty interesting relationship with Native American people at Haskell and around the country. 3 years later, my father never trusted me with the drill. None of we boys, when we turned 11, he would let us plow, but he didn't trust us with a drill because if you run out, you never know, and the wheat just doesn't come up. So I finally got to plant my own plants, and those were domestic sunflowers with heads this big, and they grew in about 6 weeks, and it just blew my mind that I actually pulled it off. So this was my pen to Van Gogh and my gift to Kansas, and the first piece, the second piece that I created just out of, actually the second piece was a portrait of Will Rogers that I did also in southwest Kansas, but this was more of a quilt-like pattern, and there were, Dan Dancer came along at this time, and photographers began to collaborate with me on, and of course I work with farmers and ag extension agents and school kids, and began to realize that that the power of the work was the collaborative community working together around an art project. And we actually harvested the sunflowers and sold the seed and harvested the soybeans. This was actually the second year of this. I don't know if I have the first picture. A commission piece in tribute to Grant Wood for the Iowa Sesquicentennial, somewhat in Grant Wood style, although I didn't look specifically at one of his pictures. I made up my own Grant Wood inspired piece. And I thought this was kind of fun with the corn planted coming out. I mean, it's actual corn planted, and then the roads covered in sand, and there's the tractor off to the side. But this is 4 acres. So Setanta is 160 acres. What was the second piece? The sunflower was 17 acres. Now we're down to 4 acres, which answers one of the questions in the earlier lunch meeting. The images began to get smaller, and you look at that and you really don't know the difference between that, do you? Whether it's 4 acres or 160, generally speaking, unless you spot a tractor or a person or a house in the piece. This is right off the end of the runway at Cedar Rapids, so the ideal location for crop art. And crop art, by the way, was a term that Dan Rather coined when they came out to shoot my sunflower field, and he introduced it on the CBS Evening News as crop artist Stan Hurd. And Peter Jennings one time called me Stan Nerd. There's a close-up. This piece was fun. I think it was like 6 weekends, and I would drive up and spend 2 or 3 nights and lay this thing out and then rush home and try to make a living. And, the Amelia Earhart piece was a commission piece. They wanted a permanent work, and so we created the face out of native stone and planted rug juniper in the hair and planted a different type of grass. We planted blue stem, little blue, tall grass prairie, and then some guy came in and sprayed the wrong spray and took it out. So we still would like to get back to that sometime, but students from around the world on some celebration in Atchison came out with flags. And this is a 1 acre piece. Now we're down to 1 acre, which is the same size that I did in New York. Carol Cadu, your lecturer who came last year, who's a friend of mine and a really tough act to follow, is Wes Jackson at the Land Institute. I began to figure out that artists that are doing something important in their time usually collaborate in their place and time with the writers, the poets, the other people who are, dare I say, cutting edge. And Wes Jackson's philosophy and spirit and belief in sustainable agriculture and monocrop, creating a sustainable and perennial crop, was the perfect person for me to butt up against. I was invited to lecture at the Land Institute and ended up doing a portrait of Carol Cadu, the daughter of tribal chairman Steve Cadu of the Kickapoo, after a trip to South America, and I discovered a painting called La Niña y el Viento, the little girl in the wind. And my thought was to do a series of portraits around the world of young indigenous women in their ancestral homeland, to talk about the fact that although most of us Europeans have traveled as far as we can to go to the next cool place, there are many people in the world that have stayed in their ancestral homeland. And what can they teach us that we don't know? What are we missing? And so Carol Cadu, of course, the Kickapoo were taken from the Great Lakes area, but Carol Cadu's portrait was created by mowing and burning and hand planting some native plants, and then turned back to the natural process. And People magazine came out, and they were going to do my first People magazine spread. And they came to the house and interviewed me, and I had my guitar, and I was doing everything, I'm a really hip guy. And then the editors got back, and they saw this picture, and they said, yeah, it's not very pretty. So they never did the story. Certainly, people have been creating incredible designs on the planet that inspired me from early days. The Nazca Desert drawings, for one. This piece is, I think, called Cerros Unidos in Chile, and I think it's 400 feet tall. And apparently, the Chilean Air Force, until in the late '60s, used it for target practice, which is the pock marks on a pretty good target, pretty good shots. Anyway, these designs are still being discovered out there. There's some incredible things in England and in South America and even in the United States that are still being discovered. So I certainly pay my homage to those early people. Saginaw Grant, Dan Dancer, the photographer, was not around when I did the first portrait of Setanta, so I really didn't have good photographs of my work. And when it's gone, that's all you got, photographs and film. So Dan said, well, what would you do another portrait? And so I met Saginaw Grant. I think he's not there. I met Saginaw Grant. Does it go back? Yeah. Who was a dancer at the Haskell Medicine Wheel, or Haskell powwow, and he was a Sac and Fox man, and I photographed him and then received his permission, and he ended up coming to the field and flying over in an airplane, and we had all of Haskell out there, the intertribal folks. And and then you can see the tractor on the headband. So this is back to 28 acres. But what I wanted to do here was to get back away. My images began to get very quilt-like, very graphic, kind of color field. Oh, that's a fun one. And so I wanted to see once more if I could actually work on the land like you would with a charcoal on paper. So it was mown and dug deep and dug light and some left alone. And that was kind of a fun piece. The school kids came to get involved. I'm going the wrong way. So then this relationship with Native people ends up with an invitation to Haskell Indian Nations University with Dan Wildcat and the President Bob Martin, and they said, the Columbus celebration's coming up, and a lot of Native people are not real excited about celebrating Columbus's arrival 500 years ago. So what can we do that would be a positive, forward-thinking thing that's not an apology, but that is, as Dan Wildcat so eloquently put, that is what do we do the next 500 years? How do we work together? So I was incredibly honored to be invited by the tribal leaders and the spiritual leaders of a couple of the tribes, because we asked their permission and whether they thought this was a viable project. And Les Evans, the Laguna Potawatomi instructor, got his students involved because I felt very uncomfortable being non-Native American, creating a medicine wheel. But they came up with the idea, and I said, in this particular piece, I'm just a component of this. I know how to do things on a big scale. You guys have to come up with this design. I'll be a part of it, but I stepped back a little bit. And I've got a pretty big ego when it comes to my art. I mean, I want to be the guy that's out there, waving the... But it just taught me a lot, that I needed to step back from the ego that's about art. And if I really believe in this collaboration, then that it should be more visible in its manifestation. And so we got involved in this, and I'll tell a quick story, and Jim's going to whack me if I go over too much, but we had the design laid out, the circle with the 4 points with stones from the original buildings from 1880s. The students, the young babies of the early inhabitants, are buried 400 yards from here in a beautiful little graveyard. I mean, this place is deeply imbued with spiritual power as far as I'm concerned. And then Leslie created this incredible spirit bird from the east, and it just blew me. I just laughed out loud when I saw the sketch. It just kind of blew me away that it just stuck clear out there in the trees. So an Omaha young man who was on the grounds crew was asked to go mow around it. And I flew over in the airplane that weekend, and he got to that point and he quit. And suddenly this incredible thing that encompassed our design made the design. And I said, stop, don't let him go back and do anything else. That's the design. The design was pulled together by this incredibly beautiful, concentric, reflective mowing around this piece, and even like here, this little, I mean, whatever he was doing, he was so incredibly tuned into what he was doing out there. He wasn't just mowing, which was my reminder that we are throwing this down, and that other people that come along will interpret it and move it in the directions that they need to. My New York project, I'd finally decided that I was not going to end up 60 years old out in Kansas, this wacko, crazy, rural eccentric guy on a tractor that people are going, oh my God, he thinks he's an artist. So I went, I'm going to go to New York. I told my wife, and we had a 3-year-old son at the time, and I said, I'm going to New York. Trump's got property. I'm going to go do a project if it kills me. And it just about did. I spent 9 months up there. I worked with Ryan and Lone Wolf. Well, you'll see pictures of them. But I wanted to do a throwdown. It's kind of a Benton-inspired, undulating, pristine landscape juxtaposed against the concrete canyons of New York. Trump was trying to develop this land. He had a whole bunch of people that were trying to get in his pockets to to use this land, this 20 acres. This is 1 acre of the 20. And one of them was an art group, and they had they had a bunch of different art groups that were trying to get 50 grand out of Trump to use this property, and then they would be more supportive of working with him on the larger thing. And I just stumble into this, Kansas farm boy with my cowboy boots on. But they really liked me because my dad raises thoroughbreds, and one of the guys was a thoroughbred guy. So anyway, I was in, and they basically said, well, what are you trying to get? And I said, well, I want the land. And they said, you don't want money? And I said, well, yeah, I'll take money, but I want the land. I just want to, I want to use the land. And the vice president told me later that when they were talking to Trump's, that, he said, well, what's Hurd want? And he said, he just wants the land. He said, well, give it to Hurd. So I had the project. And I met Trump at the end, and he was a nice enough guy, but the hair is a little strange. So this is my, the soybeans from Kansas, and corn, and flowers, and squash, and pumpkins, and the homeless guys that helped me. There's a close-up. I mean, and it just kicked my tail in to do this thing. 9 months, I had 32 trips. I had $20,000 in sponsorship from 2 different people. The Absolut Vodka guy actually gave me $10,000. And then I started raising money in other ways and spending my wife and I's money. And I'm no longer married. Anyway, so this is Ryan, is the young fellow next to the bald-headed guy, which is me, and Lone Wolf those 2 guys were homeless guys. Michael was a college student. So these guys are living under the channels there, or under the areas, and they came out, and finally I got close enough to them that I could turn my project. When I left and got on the plane, I would turn it over to Ryan and Lone Wolf, and I would come back, and they would be arguing about how deep to plant squash plants. No, you never plant them that. You plant them up on them. And it was just an amazing thing. So on occasional mornings, I would be up in Trump Towers talking with the vice presidents, and then slipping off to, eat beans and port wine with homeless guys. So it was the quintessential New York experience, and I loved it, but I wouldn't want to do it again. And there it is on the west side of the Hudson River. And a young filmmaker came along 4 years ago from Kansas, and from Lawrence, and said that he wanted to do a movie about how this work, while it didn't really gain me the notoriety and the fortune and the fame that I was maybe hoping would happen, that it kind of changed the lives of these homeless guys, especially one young guy, Ryan. And so Chris, I kind of laughed at the idea, because everybody in Lawrence wants to make a movie. I mean, you can't find somebody that doesn't want to make a movie. And so he raised $1 million, and these are young students, young kids from a work program that came out. So Chris Ordahl came along and made Earthwork, and Earthwork's been traveling now for 2 years in film festivals, and has won, I think, a dozen, not big festivals, but Colorado Springs and Oklahoma City and Savannah, Georgia, and it was a little strange. But so he made a movie and hired John Hawkes, the actor who was in, well, he was just in Winter's Bone. If anybody's seen Winter's Bone, it's an incredible film. And John played me, and I never wore a hat like that. But he was really a good guy, and they made a movie. And it's an independent film, and I think it showed in the Kansas City Film Festival. And it's traveling around, and it may be back. So they're trying to get a distribution deal. In between the New York project, I drove back, spent the night with my son and wife, got in the car and drove to Sedalia, Missouri, 5 out of 6 weekends, and painted a portrait of Scott Joplin on the wall, putting that money back into the New York project. Prairie Hinge, Jim, how are we doing time-wise? Is it 30 yet? Okay. This was, William Least Heat Moon did a sketch in his book, Blue Highways, or what was the other book? Prairie Earth, of a sketch off of a kind of a pictograph, is that what you call it, I think, out in Kansas. So I stole it from him since he took it off the wall and created this 400-foot figure, and I did it in collaboration with Eugene Friesen, who's the cellist with the Paul Winter Consort, and for 6 years, Eugene was commissioned to create a symphony called Grasslands, and we would play Grasslands here in this incredibly beautiful chunk of the Chautauqua uplift and just below the Flint Hills area. And then the piece was created out of stone, so that's the spear point sticking down there. That gives you an idea of the size. So we just moved stones around, and that image, I presume, will be there until the cows knock it off. But that was a fun piece. Then I'm back to the Land Institute 10 years, or a few years later, creating a portrait of Aldo Leopold, Sand County Almanac author, and created it elongated it, computer generated, so that it would be seen looking back off the hilltop there with Eugene Friesen playing cello and the Leopold family reading poetry from their father's book. That was a magical evening. So, you know, the coolest part about my work is that I get to sit at the feet of Leon Shenandoah, Chief of Chiefs of the Iroquois, Jake Swamp of the Mohawk, Eugene Friesen with the Paul Winter Consort. You know, I met Donald Trump. But I mean, there's some really amazing people have come into my life because of my work. I won't talk about this much. That was in Lincoln, Nebraska, kind of my Cezanne piece, Harvest. A rock work, I'm not wild about these pieces. This is a rock work for the Burt Nash Center, and it's falling off the slope because the river keeps coming up. My Rosa Blanca piece, this is probably one of my least successful art designs, but the story of how we did it, we flew to Havana, Cuba. A friend of mine's father was head of Latin American Studies. He says we should go to Cuba, and I said, yeah, everybody wants to do that. So we go down, somehow we go on a license, and we spend 6 days and somehow work with the Ministry of Small Bricks. And, we create this white rose by mounding it up, and with these incredible people, I mean, these incredible Cuban workers. Our one lady, Carolina Sanchez, turned to me one time and she said, Estevio there, he's a real communist. And I was like, I mean, she was a big friend of Fidel. I thought, well, so how many layers of communists are there? But they embraced us. Senator Pat Roberts was head of Senate Intelligence and gave me a letter of recommendation, got us back into Cuba a second time, and Fidel Castro gave us a letter welcoming us to the country. So if this isn't what the power of art can be, I've never been involved in anything. Like I said, the image didn't do much for me, but the white rose is Jose Marti's poem, I Cultivate a White Rose, which I'm going to do now. I cultivate a white rose in January and as in July for the sincere friend who tears out the heart with which I live, but for the person who, I think I just messed it up, how's it go? I cultivate a white rose in January as in July for the sincere friend who extends his hand, but for the person who tears out my heart, I cultivate a white rose. So the very idea of cultivating something of beauty for both those who love you and those who you are fighting against, just the concept of it. You don't even have to do it. If you just think about it, it somehow changes things, which is obviously what the United States and Cuba have been about for a long time. So this was my most important work, just because I was in Cuba. We didn't have money to do it. We raised some funds even in Johnson County. And we went down there and 3 trips. And the last trip I sat for a 3-hour and 45-minute at the Karl Marx Theater listening to Fidel's talk. And their poor students from all over the island were there, all excited the first hour, not so much the second, and all sleeping the third. There's the students on the White Rose. I mean, that's 5 days' work. And then the hurricanes have knocked it off 2 or 3 times, and they've rebuilt it. The Marti family, Jose Marti, died in 1898. His great-great-grandson and his beautiful wife. And then Jorgito. I miss those folks. So back from working with the communists, Neiman Marcus, the Alpha and the Omega. So I was commissioned to do a piece for the Neiman Marcus Christmas catalog. So I play both sides of the aisle. And they paid me well to do this, and then they advertised that I would go do a piece in your corporate backyard for $160,000, and that stands still. To make a living, I've had to do commercial pieces, and ideally got to choose the ones that I wanted to live with. And so obviously Absolut Vodka, Andy Warhol's was the first that Michel Roux, the president of Carolina Importers, talked him into creating this series, and I got to be involved in that. Fresh Horses with Garth Brooks down in Oklahoma. Didn't get to meet Garth, which upset the family in Southwest Kansas. A collaborative mural with Louis Copt in Emporia of the Flint Hills. Zophanctinus, the fish within a fish, the big fish out at the Sternberg. And then I created it in a field, not for interactivity, but just because my son was fascinated by mazes in his youth. Bill Curtis's ranch in southeast Kansas, 10,000-acre ranch. Curtis is from Chicago, incredible guy. Kansas beginnings, and so I got to be artist in residence on the ground. And this is just a painting of the Prairie Burn from down there. Sculpture by the Coffin Brothers, and Bill and I at the reception. One of the parts of the commission were to create an earthwork, and he called me on the road from Mongolia. And I was driving to the airport, and he said, "Stan, Bill Curtis." And I said, "I thought you were in Mongolia." "I am." So he said, "Well, I've seen this beautiful rock work, and this is," so anyway, I did sketches, and we ended up creating a 100-ton dual circular piece with this kind of pattern in the middle that would become kind of a walking place, and then you could rise up at the top and look out, and kind of one circle representing the ancient, one circle representing everybody that's come after the tallgrass prairie and the Osage. And really kind of hard to get to. It's not. This is just a buffalo sketch that I did. I did a little squibble drawing and then worked with my friends with computers, and I really like this. It's kind of my iconic buffalo. It was in a novel recently, and there's the buffalo on Prairie Hinge. And I highly recommend you go down. You have to have a little sense of adventure and spirit to go track down how to get out there, but you can walk out to it. It's a ways out, but it's beautiful. Just threw this in because I get a call on occasion from somebody like Buena Vista Pictures who wants me to help promote a movie, but they couldn't tell me what it was, and then I find out it's Signs with Mel Gibson. And I didn't get to do the work in the movie, which probably paid really well. And so this one was just, I created it in the air traffic pattern at O'Hare just to be discovered 5 days before the movie premiered, so that the news media would all go gaga over it and try to figure out if it was aliens. And so I swore that I would never tell anybody, but it's been 10 years, so who cares? Her symbol, just on occasion, when we were in Yugoslavia and we bombed the Chinese embassy by mistake, my friend Wen Yi Hong, I just called her 3 days later and I said, I just feel like I should do something, not an apology, but something, because American-Chinese relations were going south. And she came back with this design of harmony, her, And after completing the image, I found out that that design, and maybe somebody in the audience knows more about this than me, I'm sure, that that is wheat or plant, and that is mouth, harmony, mouth food. My plow for the Neerman Museum, who might want a really nice piece. I decided years ago that because I used these plows to create my works, that I wanted to manipulate them. And so this is the first, and I've got 3 more plows in the studio that I'll work on over the years. But I simply carved out sycamore and hand-hammered brass, copper into the recess and ground this down and sealed it. And it was just a lot of fun to kind of pull that into an art piece, and I'd like to do a series of those. Yes, I was a supporter of Mr. Obama, and I did a portrait of him down in Texas when he was head-to-head with Hillary. And I think he finally kind of won Texas, but my friends with a dog actually laid that out in stone in 5 days. So this is how crazy I get when I've had 2 glasses of good Merlot. This is a 16-story Trojan horse steel sculpture, and I've actually talked to some folks that said, yeah, it's possible. And with Abu Dhabi in the background, so the idea of creating, and I haven't actually done a piece in Dubai yet, Allison. I'm just talking with him about it. I haven't done something over there, but a new project has just come up this week. In the least of the Emirates, I can't even name it. There's the smallest emirate. Their leader died. So this is just the crazy kind of things that pop out of my head, and I'm just crazy enough to show them to people. But so the idea would be you would go up in elevators, and then there would be a museum to the world horse, the Arabian horse that was bred to the English that became the thoroughbred, that came to the United States that became the quarter horse. The history of horse and the idea that horsemen, my family, my father, and the Maktoum family would share in common the bloodlines. One of the things that I've been doing is I'm also an associate producer on film, which goes back to the Prairie Renaissance concept that, as I said earlier in our dinner engagement, what I think is at foot is that 15 years ago or so, I had decided to leave Kansas and go to a place that was a little more supportive of the arts, usually the coast. A lot of young people do that. Well, about the time I was on the doorstep, a friend, Scott Richardson, I met, had just moved back from A&E. He's from Kansas, but had moved to New York for 15 years and was an A&E vice president. And if he'd have stayed, he was going to the top. He hated it, and he wanted to be back in Kansas. And he brought his wife and his 2 young children, and they've struggled and struggled, but I got with him. He was with Bill Curtis. Bill Curtis named me the the artist in residence. Then we got with Kevin Wilmot, and we got involved in film. 3 years ago, we created and wrote, they created and wrote The Only Good Indian. I was associate producer. West Studi, we shot it all in the Flint Hills, in the place where they have a burn now every year, and people come from the coast, where they have this incredible concert that 5,000 people sign up for the first 10 minutes. Lyle Lovett was there last year. We are at and in the middle of, I think, a Prairie Renaissance, where people on the coast are tired of all of that. Certainly it's out there. We all want to go to the MoMA, but the potential out here is grand for art, for music, for film, and if we stay here, that's what Kevin Wilmot says, then we can actually make a difference. So there's Wes on the 1905 motorcycle, and we had a grand time out at the Grand Central Hotel, Susan's Hotel in the Flint Hills. If you haven't been out there, I highly recommend it. So my conjecture is that this is the coolest place to be on the planet right now, Kansas. Thank you so much. You're all still here. Oh, one person left. Get that guy's name, would you? The Grand Central Hotel is right downtown Cottonwood Falls. Strong city, you know, the rodeo, you go down about a mile, and it's, I don't know if it's 5-star, but it might as well be. wonderful wine selection, great steaks. Susan Barnes is just a class act. I mean, how many of you been to Cottonwood Falls? See, I mean, there you go, half the crowd. It's amazing, isn't it? And then, there's a lot to talk about there, but water. Questions? Did you ladies, you didn't fall asleep, did you?
I'm curious in the process. I mean, how do you notice a sketch or something?
Mm-hmm.
And then do you blow it up?
She asked about the process, which is something I always forget to do. All the good ideas, I mean, talk to Michelangelo, all the good ideas come out on a little sketch pad at the bar, you know. I mean, you come up with your conceptual ideas very small, usually. And then you go through your sketchbook and you find the one that you like that speaks to your project. And then when I start thinking in terms of it as a field image, it changes somehow, and it's just defined differently. I don't know why that is, but it's more graphic and it's more finite. They're you know, components and strong lines, and then I get that sketch when I'm comfortable with it, and I grid it. Then I go onto the field with a transit and a crew. Hurry back. And there were students. I shouldn't do that. I'll be there in a minute. But then I just simply do a grid and put flags in the ground. So on the Satanta portrait, the first one I did, 144 flags. And then on my sketch, I knew that I started at flag 100 and went into 78 and into 63 and into 42, and then and just measured off of those points to find the land. It's really fairly simple math. I mean, it doesn't take a genius to do it. Now, the ideas of what to do next after you've laid it out and the different levels, you know, that's what I work with farmers and horticulturists and people smarter than me. But it's fun. You have to come out. And somebody asked me earlier, you know, I may be getting kind of tired of the earthworks. I'm always that's why the rock work was really fun for me. I mean, I want to be continually evolving, and I hope that if we do something here, that through a process of working with Allison and Bruce and Jim and folks and the students, that the opportunity rises to do something beyond what I've done before. That's what would excite me more than anything. And I think that's what you guys are hoping for. Yes, ma'am.
Is there somewhere close that we can see one of these pieces of art like Lawrence or Nazca or?
The rock work that I said I wasn't so pleased with because it's eroded is on the riverbank in Lawrence. And I kind of wish they would either take it off or put the money into refurbishing it instead of just kind of letting it atrophy. I guess maybe that's all right. I mean, entropy is not bad. The Haskell medicine wheel is there. It's also not another roadside attraction. They don't really advertise it, but people are certainly welcome to walk down to it. And it's a special place. The Native American Church and the Christian-affiliated Native churches have both had ceremonies down there, which is gratifying for me because they embrace it for what it is, which is a contemporary art piece that came through the Native American students and professor with the help of an artist. But it's you know, the sacredness of that piece. Somebody had a thing, you know, is it sacred? Well, the ground is sacred. I mean, there are probably young Indian people buried there. It's not the artwork that's sacred. We've simply brought maybe some new level of attention to the sacredness of the original site. Yes, ma'am? Oh, somebody right behind you. Well, you know, early on, my environmental philosophy was that, I mean, I don't know what your thinkings are, but I kind of like a big mountain that's not carved more than a mountain that's carved. And I'm not putting down what they did. I think that was, you know, Mount Rushmore and those things are beautiful, but I like the idea that that the fields are returned to a utilitarian purpose, that it's kind of a respect for the natural landscape, that I'm not trying to leave my my print on it forever. Although the permanent pieces, if they're in a, the other possibility that I think has merit would be to go into a landfill or something, or a place that, or a landscape that's been denuded that maybe shouldn't have been broken from native prairie, and reinvigorate it, and in so doing maybe create an image. So I think there's, I think there's possibilities of doing permanent works. You know, the piece I did on Bill Curtis's ranch, I mean, I went into a beautiful pristine hill and made it art. Does that make it, you know, I mean, I know I have some friends that are real environmentalists that would probably look down their nose at that a little bit. Bill paid me to do it. He wanted to do it. He owned the land. I did it. But there's a certain part of hubris there, you know, that you're going to go into, destroy a little bit of landscape to pay homage to the landscape. So I try to be just aware of that, but I'm also not I'm a practical guy. You know, I'm trying to survive. I've got a 19-year-old son who's just, you know, learning that really nice guitars cost money.
Stan, when you're working on a piece on the field, do you have somebody in the plane directing you during the piece, or you just do the piece and then you go up in the air?
I've not had direction from the air yet that I know of, but I fly when I can. And there have been times where I work on a piece for months and I realize I've never flown over it. Maybe that's what's nice about the photographers that fly over it, because they bring back, I liken it to kind of a state of a print for you printmakers. You know, I pull my print and I go, ooh, that's kind of working. These colors, I could do this. And then I go back at it. And then I pull another print, another photograph of it in a more evolving. A lot of workers. I mean, that's, again, you know, especially if we do something here, the idea would be to work with the art students that I met today and the horticulture students. Well, and hopefully even get involved. I mean, you know, I'm not the fountain of all grand artistic ideas. I hope the students, you know, push me in some direction. I mean, I'm not easily pushed, but I can be pushed. And Allison, I mean, this is an incredible little island of synergy and multidiscipline activity, and I would be a fool not to take advantage of that with Leica and her, where's Leica? Back, you know, I mean, her students, and there's just a lot of good energy here. That's why I'm excited about it, is that I've really not done anything quite like this, thus the challenge to rise above what I've done before in some way. One last thought, my kind of quintessential project that I'm probably not supposed to talk about, but you guys won't spread it around. I got to go to Sao Paulo, Brazil 6 months ago at the invitation of a man who's worked there for 17 years from England. And Sao Paulo is this kind of evolving place right now. They call it a brick nation. It's got a stable government. They just had the last president was just handpicked his successor, who was very popular, a woman president, first woman president of Brazil. And 100-acre piece off the end of the runway that would be permanent, take 2 years to build, working with community, creating with this favela, which is a shanty town of people. There's a lot of poverty. They actually care about the poverty there. I mean, they seem to be fairly conscientious of it. The government's probably a little left-leaning, but they've come back. The wealthy class is very successful. They seem to be getting along well. It could all fall apart next week, I suppose. But very interesting dynamics. Asked the guy about politics in the United States, and I said, what do you think? He said, we don't even know what's going on in the United States. We're focused on what's going on here. I mean, we're really not that important to some folks out there. And it was surprising me a little bit. He just like, you know, good luck with that, you know. But I'm just fascinated by the possibility that the World Cup is in 2014, and massive corporations down there. They've had ethanol out of sugarcane for years, so when the fuel crisis hit everybody else, it didn't affect them. And they're just it's a really pretty, and I would spend a lot of the next 2 years down there if we did the project, and involve these people from the favela and leave them with a permanent image that then they would oversee, and it would be a legacy for them. And it would be, and work with the artists there and the students there. So that's, if you were going to ask what my dream project was, this is a small version of it here, but that's kind of the type of thing that, and I'm 60 now, and I've still got my legs under me, and I'm ready to work. I absolutely believe my best stuff's in front of me, and that I'm just a kid. Thank you, folks. Jim, we're going to come up and do something. Did you have one thing in the back, young lady? Like the big Prairie Hinge, every stone was from within 4 miles of the location. And it was very important because the guys that were the stone guys, they hadn't done it for years. And I got to hang out with these stonemasons, 3rd generation, and they took me to all of these places. And as they got to like me better, they started showing me cooler places, So that's very important, yes. Thank you. That was a good question. Thank you, folks.